생존자 접근 중!
10 years after it first turned a routine commute into a moral panic attack, Train to Busan is returning to North American theaters on August 14th in a remastered 4K anniversary edition. Directed by Yeon Sang-ho, this modern classic has earned its re-release because its monsters have barely aged, and neither have its humans. The film's real horror isn't infection but exposure. Strip away comfort, law, and time, and personality becomes destiny. In this video, we'll revisit Train to Busan through a psychologist's lens to explore attachment, collective panic, moral collapse, and the frightening price people pay, both to survive and to remain human. Our very first angle would be Seok-woo's fatherhood and the attachment wound hiding beneath it. Before the infected passengers begin smashing their faces against the train windows, Train to Busan introduces a quieter form of damage. A little girl who has already stopped expecting her father to show up. Seok-woo, played with remarkable restraint by Gong-yoo, is not cruel to Suan. That would almost be easier to understand. He provides for her, worries about her safety, and clearly believes he is doing what a responsible father should. But he has confused provision with presents. When he forgets that he has already bought Suan a Nintendo Wii and gives her another one for her birthday, the moment is played gently, almost comically. Psychologically, however, it is devastating. He knows what children are supposed to want, but he does not know his own child well enough to remember what she already has. The duplicate gift becomes a perfect symbol of their relationship, materially complete, emotionally absent. Suan does not throw a tantrum because she has already adapted to disappointment. Children living with emotionally unavailable parents often become unusually self-contained. They learn to reduce their needs because expressing those needs repeatedly and receiving no meaningful response is painful. Suan's maturity, therefore, is not simply evidence that she is a good child. It may also be a survival strategy. She has begun parenting her own emotions because Seok-woo is rarely available to help her regulate them. Her insistence on traveling to Busan to see her mother is not merely a plot device that places them on the train. It is an attachment protest. Suan is trying to move toward the parent she associates with emotional safety, even if reaching her means traveling without her father. Seok-woo initially treats the trip as another problem to manage. He rearranges his schedule, drives her to the station, and boards the train. But he still behaves like a man completing an obligation. He is physically beside his daughter without truly being with her. Then the outbreak begins, and the film turns physical proximity into an emotional test. At first, Seok-woo's parenting remains governed by the same mentality he uses at work. Protect your own interests, calculate risk, and do not become responsible for strangers. He quietly tells Suan that, in a crisis, she must look after herself. It sounds practical. It is also the moral philosophy of a man who has spent years justifying his absence as necessity. Suan immediately understands what he does not, that surviving by abandoning everyone else is its own kind of death. This is why Sang-hwa, played by Dong-seok, matters beyond being the film's resident zombie punching machine. Sang-hwa is everything Seok-woo is not: emotionally expressive, physically present, and instinctively protective. He comforts his pregnant wife, jokes with her, and risks himself for people he barely knows. His masculinity is not built around distance, but responsibility. Standing beside him, Seok-woo is forced to confront a painful truth. Fatherhood is not the ability to keep danger away from your child. It is the willingness to enter danger so that your child does not face it alone. The zombies do not magically transform Seok-woo into a loving father. They simply remove every excuse he once used to avoid becoming one. Gradually, his decisions stop being calculations and become acts of connection. He returns for others. He begins listening to Suan's moral instincts instead of dismissing them as childish innocence. Most importantly, he starts behaving in a way that allows her to depend on him. Their bond moves from avoidant distance toward emotional security, not because he promises to change someday, but because, carriage by carriage, he proves that she matters more than his comfort, status, or survival. Ji-ho understands this transformation instinctively. His characters rarely stop to announce that they are becoming selfish. Their moral boundaries shrink one practical decision at a time. Seok-woo initially responds through calculation. He observes, assesses, and protects Suan. But his definition of responsibility extends no further than his daughter. Sang-hwa responds physically, moving toward danger because protecting others is almost automatic for him. Some passengers freeze. Others follow whoever speaks most confidently, even when that person is clearly acting out of panic. These are not simply different levels of bravery. They are different stress responses unfolding inside the same confined experiment. The film is especially perceptive about how quickly fear seeks permission. Most people do not want to see themselves as cruel. Even in a crisis, they need a story that makes cruelty feel responsible. This is why frightened groups rarely say, "Let us abandon those people because we are cowards." They say, "We cannot take the risk." They convert an emotional reaction into the language of logic. That distinction becomes brutal when the surviving passengers fight their way through multiple infected carriages, only to be treated as potential threats by the people hiding safely behind another door. The group knows these survivors are human. They can see their exhaustion and injuries. But fear introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty becomes enough to suspend compassion. What if one of them has been bitten? What if opening the door endangers everyone? The questions sound reasonable. That is precisely what makes the scene horrifying. Once frightened, people decide that another group may be dangerous. Evidence becomes almost irrelevant. Psychologists call this threat amplification. When the nervous system is highly activated, the possibility of danger begins to feel like proof of danger. The outsiders are no longer individuals, parents, children, friends, or exhausted survivors. They become a contaminated category, and categories are much easier to sacrifice than people. This is also where Train to Busan moves beyond the usual zombie film fantasy of courageous individuals versus obvious cowards. Fear becomes social. One passenger's panic validates another's. Hesitation becomes suspicion. Suspicion becomes accusation. Accusation becomes collective certainty. Nobody wants to be the only person arguing for compassion if that compassion might get everyone killed. So the group begins outsourcing its conscience. We see the psychological pull of conformity at work. When people are uncertain, they watch others for instructions about how to behave. The louder and more decisive voice often becomes the leader, not because it is correct, but because certainty feels comforting during chaos. A terrified person offering a confident plan can become more persuasive than a compassionate person admitting uncertainty. The infected operate through biological contagion, but the survivors are vulnerable to emotional contagion. Panic passes between them without a single bite. That is why the train itself is such a powerful setting. Every carriage creates a temporary tribe, complete with insiders, outsiders, and borders. A glass door becomes a moral boundary. The passengers can still see the people they are excluding, which means they cannot pretend ignorance. They must watch suffering occur and continue protecting the barrier that allows it. Yang Sang-ho's bleakest observation is not that frightened people become monsters. It is that they can remain recognizably ordinary while participating in monstrous decisions. They do not lose their humanity in one dramatic moment. They redefine humanity until it includes only the people standing on their side of the door. Our third angle would be collective panic, and how Train to Busan shows that fear can infect an entire group without spilling a single drop of blood. The film's zombies spread the old-fashioned way. One bite, one victim, one violently rearranged spine at a time. But Yan Sang-ho is equally interested in another contagion, one that travels through words. It begins with a suggestion, acquires authority through repetition, and eventually becomes a belief nobody remembers choosing.
This is where Dong-seok, the transport executive played by Kim Yui-sung, becomes so psychologically important. He is not physically powerful. He cannot fight like Sang-hwa, lead like Seok-woo, eventually learns to or offer the instinctive compassion we see in Suan. What he possesses is something more useful inside a frightened crowd, the ability to give panic a vocabulary. When Sikwoo and the others finally reach what should be a safe carriage, Dong-seok does not need evidence that they are infected. He only needs to introduce the possibility. He points at their clothes, their exhaustion, their proximity to the infected. Then he transforms uncertainty into accusation. Within moments, the passengers stop seeing the people in front of them as survivors. They see them as potential carriers. This is a classic example of scapegoating. When people face a threat they cannot control, they often redirect their fear toward a target they can punish, exclude, or remove. The infection is invisible until symptoms appear. Nobody knows how far it has spread or whether Busan is truly safe. That helplessness is psychologically unbearable. But the passengers can control a door. They can identify an outsider. They can force someone into another carriage and briefly experience the illusion of control. The cruelest detail is that the group does not merely reject the survivors. They convince themselves that rejection is the responsible choice. Collective panic rarely feels like madness from the inside. It feels like caution. Dong-seok understands this, whether consciously or not. He frames compassion as recklessness and exclusion as common sense. Once he does that, anyone defending Seok-woo's group risks appearing irresponsible. The passengers are no longer asking, "Are these people infected?" They are asking, "Can we afford to find out?" That shift matters because it transfers the burden of proof. The survivors must somehow demonstrate that they are completely safe, while the frightened crowd requires no evidence at all to justify its suspicion. Psychology calls this a form of confirmation bias. Once the group accepts that the outsiders may be dangerous, every detail begins supporting that conclusion. Their blood-stained clothing looks suspicious. Their desperation feels aggressive. Even their insistence that they are healthy can be interpreted as something an infected person would say. And once everybody begins agreeing, dissent becomes socially expensive. This is the bystander effect in reverse. Instead of people remaining passive because responsibility is dispersed, they participate in cruelty because responsibility is shared. No single passenger has to say, "I condemn these people, the group did it." Fear becomes democratic, and guilt disappears into the vote. The bitter irony arrives almost immediately. The passengers who fought through infected carriages and risked their lives for strangers are sent away, while the supposedly safe group remains protected by nothing more than its own confidence. The barricade does not separate the healthy from the infected. It separates those who still recognize a collective responsibility from those who have reduced survival to private property. Yeon Sang-ho had explored class resentment and social division before Train to Busan, particularly in his animated work. Here, he translates those concerns into the clean geography of a train. First class, economy, vestibule, locked door, every physical division becomes an excuse for moral division. The train is already designed to separate passengers according to status. The outbreak merely teaches them to weaponize those boundaries. That is why the zombies almost become secondary during these scenes. Their violence is automatic. They do not deliberate, manipulate, or pretend their hunger serves the greater good. The humans do. By the time Dong-seok starts sacrificing other passengers to save himself, his behavior feels like the logical conclusion of the psychology he introduced earlier. First, the group decides that some lives are more dangerous than others. Then it decides that some are less valuable. Eventually, pushing another human being toward death begins to resemble strategy. The real infection in Train to Busan is therefore not selfishness alone. It is the speed with which selfishness becomes socially acceptable once somebody calls it safety. Zombies can destroy a body in seconds. Collective panic does something more disturbing. It allows perfectly ordinary people to destroy their conscience and still believe they made the sensible choice. Our fourth angle would be Dong-seok and how he turns the cold logic of corporate power into a method of survival. Dong-seok, played with infuriating precision by Kim Ui-sung, is the passenger everyone hates. He lies, manipulates crowds, abandons vulnerable people, and eventually uses human bodies as disposable shields. It would be easy to diagnose him as a psychopath and move on. But that interpretation is almost too comforting, because Dong-seok's behavior is not chaotic, impulsive, or detached from reality. It is organized, strategic, and horrifyingly familiar. He does not behave like a madman. He behaves like an institution protecting itself. Even before the outbreak, Dong-seok's identity is tied to authority. As a senior executive of the train company, he expects information, access, and preferential treatment. When the social order begins collapsing, he does not surrender that hierarchy. He rebuilds it inside the emergency. Other passengers become resources, obstacles, or liabilities, while his own survival remains the unquestioned priority. Psychologically, this resembles what researchers sometimes describe as corporate psychopathy, not necessarily a clinical diagnosis, but a pattern involving low empathy, manipulation, superficial confidence, and an ability to treat people as instruments. In ordinary circumstances, Such traits can hide behind polished language, efficiency, risk management, leadership, or protecting the organization. Inside Train to Busan, the outbreak removes the office vocabulary and exposes the underlying principle. If another person is useful, Dong-seok controls them. If they become dangerous, he discards them. What makes him especially disturbing is his ability to convert self-interest into public interest. He rarely announces that he wants someone excluded because their presence frightens him personally. Instead, he insists that their exclusion is necessary for everyone's safety. He presents selfishness as leadership. This is how institutional cruelty often functions. Harm is rarely described as harm. It becomes policy, protocol, or an unfortunate but necessary decision. Once suffering is translated into administrative language, the person causing it can feel responsible rather than guilty. Dong-seok's greatest weapon, therefore, is not physical strength. It is moral reframing. When Seok-woo's group reaches the supposedly secure carriage, Dong-seok convinces the passengers that these survivors must be removed. He is not simply spreading fear, he is creating a hierarchy of whose fear matters. The protected passengers' anxiety becomes more important than the lives of those who fought to reach them. Their comfort is treated as evidence. The outsider's humanity becomes negotiable. And notice how quickly the group follows him. Dong-seok offers certainty at the exact moment everyone else feels helpless. Authoritarian personalities often gain influence during crises because they reduce frightening complexity into simple categories: safe and infected, obedient and dangerous, us and them. His solution may be cruel, but it is clear. For frightened people, clarity can feel more trustworthy than compassion. The film also draws a deliberate parallel between Dong-seok and Seok-woo. Both men begin as professionally successful, emotionally detached figures trained to protect their own interests. Seok-woo is a fund manager whose decisions have already harmed ordinary people outside the train. Dong-seok is the more advanced version of that same psychology, a man who has completely fused self-preservation with entitlement. The difference is not that Seok-woo was always secretly good while Dong-seok was born evil. The difference is that Seok-woo remains capable of being changed by his relationship with Soo-an. Her disappointment disrupts his self-image. Sang-hwa's sacrifice confronts him with another model of masculinity. Other people's suffering gradually becomes real to him. Dong-seok resists that recognition until the end. Even when he becomes infected, the film briefly reveals the frightened person beneath the executive. He speaks about wanting to return home to his mother. For one uncomfortable moment, the monster becomes somebody's child. Yeon Sang-ho does not offer this detail to excuse him. He uses it to complicate our hatred. Dong-seok was capable of vulnerability all along. He simply spent the crisis denying that everyone else possessed it too. What makes him more frightening than the zombies? The infected cannot recognize another person's humanity. Dong-seok can and repeatedly decides that it is less valuable than his own. Train to Busan ultimately presents him not as an interruption of civilization, but as one of its products: hierarchy without responsibility, authority without empathy, and survival treated as a privilege reserved for whoever can force somebody else to pay its price. Our fifth and final angle would be Soo-an, and why the youngest passenger becomes the film's most important judge of what adulthood is supposed to look like. Children in disaster movies are often reduced to emotional leverage. They exist, so the adults have someone innocent to protect, and so the audience has someone vulnerable to worry about. Soo-an, played with extraordinary emotional intelligence by Kim Soo-an, certainly performs that function. But Yeon Sang-ho gives her a far more important psychological role. She is not simply the person Seok-woo must save. She is the person who sees him clearly. From the beginning, Soo-an understands her father's emotional failures better than he does. She knows he loves her, but she also knows his love repeatedly loses the competition against his work. The duplicate birthday present confirms something she has already felt. Seok-woo is familiar with the idea of his daughter, but increasingly disconnected from the actual child standing in front of him. Yet Soo-an does not respond with bitterness. She responds with empathy, sometimes more empathy than the adults around her can tolerate. When she gives her seat to the elderly woman, Seok-woo quietly tells her that, during moments like these, she should look after herself. His advice represents the worldview that has made him professionally successful. Resources are limited, vulnerability is dangerous, and survival belongs to those who protect their own interests first. But Soo-an rejects that logic with one devastating observation. She tells him that he only cares about himself and that this is why her mother left him. This is not childish insolence, it is moral accuracy. Psychologically, children often function as observers of contradictions. Adults have learned to rationalize. Seok-woo can explain his absence as work, responsibility, or financial pressure. Soo-an experiences it simply as abandonment. He can call selfishness practicality. She sees someone refusing to help. Her moral language remains uncomplicated because she has not yet learned the sophisticated vocabulary adults use to excuse cruelty. That does not make Soo a naive. In many ways, she understands the crisis more deeply than the people trying to protect her. The adults believe survival is the central problem. Suin recognizes that the kind of person one becomes, while surviving, matters just as much. She repeatedly watches fear reduce human beings to categories: infected or healthy, useful or burdensome, insiders or outsiders. But she continues seeing individuals. The homeless man is not disposable. The elderly sisters are not obstacles. The strangers behind a locked door are not acceptable losses. Her empathy preserves psychological complexity in a world determined to erase it. This is also why Suin becomes essential to Seok-woo's transformation. He does not change merely because zombies appear. Fear alone could have made him more controlling, more isolated, and even more selfish. He changes because he is forced to watch himself through his daughter's eyes. Every decision becomes part of the person she will remember, and perhaps eventually imitate. Children learn values less from what parents tell them than from what they repeatedly watch them do. This is sometimes described through social learning. Behavior becomes instruction. Seok-woo therefore faces a responsibility larger than keeping Suin alive. He is teaching her what a human being does when another person becomes inconvenient. Sang-hwa understands this instinctively. His bravery is not abstract heroism, it is care expressed through action. When he protects his pregnant wife and fights for strangers, he offers Suin and Seok-woo another model of adulthood. Strength does not mean escaping alone. It means accepting that another person's survival has become partly your responsibility. By the film's final movement, Seok-woo has absorbed that lesson. His last act is not simply parental sacrifice, it is a correction. Earlier, he taught Suin to think only of herself. Now, through his actions, he teaches her the opposite. Love becomes real when another life matters more than your fear. And then comes the song. At the beginning of the film, Suin tries to perform Aloha O at a school recital but cannot finish because her father is absent. Her voice collapses under the weight of the empty seat she hoped he would fill. Near the end, walking through the dark railway tunnel, she sings it again. This time, the song becomes an attachment signal, a child reaching for a parent who can no longer answer. It also saves her life. The soldiers waiting at the other end hear her voice and recognize that she is human. That is the film's final psychological verdict. Suin survives not because she becomes harder, more suspicious, or more ruthless, but because she preserves the very vulnerability everyone else considered dangerous. The adults spend the journey treating compassion like a weakness. Yet in the end, it is a grieving child's voice, open, trembling, and unmistakably human, that stops the cycle of fear from claiming one final victim. 10 years later, Train to Busan time still hurts, because its most devastating losses are not caused by the infected. They are caused by hesitation, exclusion, emotional absence, and the terrible human talent for disguising selfishness as common sense. Seok-woo begins the journey believing that protecting his daughter means keeping her alive. By the end, he understands that fatherhood also means giving her something worth carrying forward. Proof that fear does not have to decide who we become. Sang-hwa demonstrates that strength without compassion is merely aggression. Dong-seok shows how authority becomes dangerous when it loses empathy. And Suin, the smallest person aboard the train, becomes its clearest moral voice. She survives without surrendering her sensitivity. That may be the film's most radical idea. Yeon Sang-ho never pretends that human beings become uniformly heroic under pressure. Some rise, some collapse, and others find perfectly reasonable language for unforgivable choices. But the film also refuses complete cynicism. It suggests that empathy can be contagious too. One person's sacrifice can change another person's behavior, which can then save somebody else. Humanity passes from Sang-hwa to Seok-woo, and finally from Seok-woo to his daughter. That is what gives this August 14th re-release genuine value. We are not simply returning to watch a beautifully executed zombie classic in 4K. We are returning to a psychological question that has only become more urgent. When fear divides the world into people worth saving and people we can afford to lose, which side of the door will we choose? And perhaps that is why Suin's unfinished song stays with us longer than any scream. The zombies make the film frightening. The people make it recognizable. But that trembling voice in the tunnel reminds us what survival is supposed to preserve. If you enjoyed this psychological breakdown, subscribe, because here, we don't simply review movies, we diagnose them.